The Silent Scream. Chapter 1. The Marked Copycat. The wind howled through the empty streets of the small coastal town as Detective Evelyn Parker examined the crime scene. The victim lay sprawled in a pool of blood, her lifeless eyes staring into the void. It was a hauntingly familiar sight, too familiar. The positioning of the body, the precise slashes, the note left behind. Evelyn knew this scene, had studied it in old case files for years. It was a perfect recreation of the infamous Rose murders from over a decade ago, a case that had gone cold with no leads, no suspects. But this was no coincidence. The killer had left a calling card, a small, blood-stained photograph tucked neatly into the victim's hand. The photo showed a scene from the original Rose murders crime, a picture that had never been released to the public. The implications were chilling. The killer had access to classified information, perhaps even worked within the police force. As Evelyn stood over the body, her partner, Detective Mark Thompson, approached, his face grim. "Another one," he said quietly, handing her a second photograph. It was a crime scene from another famous cold case, the Midnight Stalker murders. The similarities were striking, right down to the precise angle of the victim's wounds. "We're dealing with a copycat," Evelyn said, her voice tight with tension. "But not just any copycat. This one knows things they shouldn't know." Mark nodded. "And they're challenging us. These photos, they're daring us to catch them." Evelyn's mind raced, piecing together the clues. This killer was meticulous, strategic, leaving no trace behind except the taunting photographs. They were playing a dangerous game, one that Evelyn knew they couldn't afford to lose. But as she stared at the photographs, a cold dread settled in her stomach. This was only the beginning. The killer had thrown down the gauntlet, and Evelyn had no choice but to pick it up. The hunt was on. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The next morning, the sun rose over the town, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Evelyn and Mark sat in the cramped briefing room, the walls lined with case files and evidence boards. The team was tense, the air thick with the weight of what they were up against. The photographs were pinned up in front of them, stark reminders of the killer's twisted game. Evelyn tapped the edge of the table, her mind racing through possibilities. This killer isn't just copying these crimes, they're replicating them with terrifying accuracy. They know details that were never made public. We need to figure out how. Could it be someone who worked on the original cases? Mark suggested. Someone with access to the files? "It's possible," Evelyn replied, her gaze fixed on the photos. "But even then, they'd need to be meticulous to recreate these scenes so precisely. This person is methodical, patient. They've studied every detail." The door to the briefing room opened and Captain Reynolds walked in, his expression grave. "We just received another report," he said, dropping a file onto the table. "Another murder, same pattern. This one matches the broken doll case from 7 years ago." Evelyn flipped open the file, her heart sinking as she recognized the scene. The victim, a young woman, had been posed like a broken doll, her limbs twisted unnaturally. A porcelain doll had been placed beside her, its face cracked, its eyes eerily lifelike. "We're dealing with a serial killer who's not just copying famous cases, they're paying homage to them," Evelyn said, her voice low. "And they're escalating." Mark frowned. "Why these cases? What's the connection?" "That's what we need to find out," Evelyn said, her mind racing. "The original cases spanned years, different cities, different victims. There has to be a common thread we're missing." Captain Reynolds crossed his arms, his gaze intense. "Whatever it is, we need to find it fast. The media is going to get wind of this soon, and when they do, it's going to be chaos. We can't let this killer keep escalating." Evelyn nodded, determination hardening her resolve. "We need to dig into the old files, interview anyone who was involved in the original investigations. There has to be something that ties these cases together." As the team dispersed to their tasks, Evelyn lingered by the photographs, a sense of unease gnawing at her. The killer was always one step ahead, taunting them with their own failures. But what? What was the endgame? Evelyn didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The clock was ticking and every second counted. Chapter 3. A Deadly Pattern. Evelyn spent the rest of the day buried in the archives, poring over old case files. The dim, flickering lights of the records room cast eerie shadows on the stacks of yellowed papers and dusty folders. Each file she opened revealed a nightmare, a life cut short, a family torn apart, and a killer who had slipped through the cracks. The cases were all too familiar, their details etched into her memory from years of studying them. But as she cross-referenced the old cases with the new murders, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern so subtle that it had gone unnoticed for years. The original crimes, though separated by time and geography, shared a common thread. Each victim had a connection, however tenuous, to a particular criminal trial, a trial that had ended in an acquittal. The victims had been witnesses, jurors, or even family members of the accused. Evelyn's heart raced as she realized the implications. The killer wasn't just recreating famous crimes. They were exacting revenge, righting perceived wrongs where justice had failed. She pulled up the files of the recently murdered victims and sure enough, found the connection. Each had played a role in a trial that ended in a controversial acquittal. But there was one more piece of the puzzle that still didn't fit: the killer's obsession with recreating the crime scenes of past serial killers. Why those specific cases? As Evelyn mulled over this, Mark appeared at the door, his face pale. "Evelyn, you need to see this." He led her to the incident room, where the entire team was gathered around a large screen. A live news broadcast was playing, and on the screen was a scene that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Another crime scene, another victim posed in a grotesque tableau, a recreation of the Black Orchid murder from 15 years ago. The newscaster's voice trembled as she described the scene, but it was the footage that held Evelyn's attention. In the background, just visible behind the police tape, was a figure. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but Evelyn caught it. A person in a hooded jacket watching the chaos unfold. The camera zoomed in, but the figure turned and vanished into the crowd, leaving only a sense of dread in their wake. "They're taunting us," Evelyn whispered. "They wanted us to see them." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "They're getting bolder. They're playing with us and they know we're chasing them. But what's their next move?" Evelyn stared at the screen, the pieces slowly coming together. The killer was escalating, growing more confident with each murder. But there was something else, something about the timing. Each new murder came quicker than the last, the intervals shortening. The killer was working on a timeline, but to what end? Suddenly it clicked. "The dates," Evelyn said, her voice urgent. "They're not just random. They correspond with the anniversaries of the original crimes." Mark's eyes widened in realization. The killer is recreating the murders on their exact anniversaries. Evelyn grabbed a nearby calendar and quickly began marking the dates. "If we're right, then the next anniversary is only 3 days away. We need to find the original case and stop this before it happens again." But as Evelyn glanced at the calendar, another thought struck her, one that sent a chill down her spine. The final anniversary, the last crime in this twisted timeline, was only a week away. And that case, the one the killer was undoubtedly saving for last, was the most notorious of all. The Mothman murders, a case that had baffled investigators for decades. "We're running out of time," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And the worst is yet to come." Chapter 4. The Mothman. The investigation intensified over the next 2 days. Evelyn and Mark worked around the clock, barely pausing to eat or sleep, as they delved into the details of the Mothman murders. The case was infamous. 3 victims, each found with mysterious symbols carved into their skin, their bodies arranged in an inexplicable pattern. The killer had been dubbed Mothman, after a witness reported seeing a shadowy figure with large, moth-like wings near one of the crime scenes, though no evidence ever supported this claim. The case had gone cold after months of dead ends, and the Mothman had become a local legend, a bogeyman whispered about in darkened rooms. But now Evelyn knew the legend was about to be reborn. She spread out the files on the table, connecting the dots with a flurry of notes and red strings. The Mothman victims had all been involved in the trial of a notorious gang leader, a trial that had ended in a shocking acquittal. The gang leader had walked free, but not long after, the 3 key witnesses had been found dead, their bodies mutilated in a manner that sent shockwaves through the community. Evelyn felt the weight of the past bearing down on her. She knew that the current killer was obsessed with this case, with bringing the horror of the Mothman back to life. But there was something more, something she couldn't quite grasp, a missing piece that eluded her. Mark entered the room, his face etched with concern. "We've identified a possible connection," he said, dropping a file in front of her. "One of the original detectives on the Mothman case. He's been living off the grid, but he surfaced a few weeks ago, just before the first murder in this new series." Evelyn looked at the file, a sense of foreboding growing within her. The detective, Michael Harlow, had been one of the lead investigators, and his life had spiraled out of control after the case went cold. His obsession with finding the Mothman had cost him his career, his family, everything. He'd vanished soon after, disappearing into the shadows like the killer he had hunted. "Do you think he's involved?" Evelyn asked, though the answer seemed painfully clear. Mark shook his head. "I'm not sure, but we need to find him. He might have information we're missing, something that could help us stop this before it's too late." Evelyn nodded, her mind racing. They were close, so close, but time was running out. The killer was on the verge of completing their twisted tribute, and Evelyn knew that if they didn't stop them now, the final murder would be the most horrific yet. But even as they closed in on their suspect, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the killer was always one step ahead. The game was nearing its end, and the stakes had never been higher. As she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood run cold. It was a photograph sent from an unknown number. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking what it showed: the exterior of her own home taken from just outside her front door. The message that accompanied it was chilling in its simplicity: "You're next." Chapter 5. The Final Tribute. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stared at the message on her phone. Her breath quickened, and the room seemed to close in around her. The killer knew where she lived. They had been there watching, waiting. The taunting message was a stark reminder that the game had become personal. This was no longer just about solving a case. This was about survival. "Evelyn." Mark's voice cut through the haze of fear, grounding her. He had seen the photo, his expression darkening with concern. "We need to get you to a safe place." But Evelyn shook her head, determination hardening her resolve. "No, that's exactly what they want, for us to scatter, to lose focus. We're too close to give them the upper hand now." She tucked the phone into her pocket, forcing her mind back to the task at hand. "We need to find Michael Harlow. He's the key to this." Mark hesitated, clearly torn between concern for her safety and the urgency of the case. But he knew Evelyn well enough to recognize that once she set her mind to something, there was no dissuading her. "All right, let's find him." They tracked Harlow to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that had once been bustling with industry but was now little more than a decaying relic of the past. The building loomed ominously in the twilight, its broken windows staring like empty eyes. Evelyn and Mark approached cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness as they entered. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. The floor was littered with debris, and the walls were covered in faded graffiti. They moved silently, their senses on high alert. Evelyn's mind raced with possibilities. Was Harlow here willingly, or had the killer drawn him into their deadly game? As they made their way deeper into the warehouse, they found a small room at the back, its door slightly ajar. Inside, Harlow sat at a rickety table, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. He looked up as they entered, and for a moment, his expression was one of relief, as if he had been waiting for them. "Evelyn Parker," Harlow said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I knew you'd come." Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the man who had once been a respected detective. "We need to talk about the Mothman murders, Harlow. The killer is recreating them, along with others. We believe you might have information that could help us stop this." Harlow let out a bitter laugh. "I spent years chasing shadows, trying to find the Mothman. You ruined me. And now you think I have the answers." "We don't have time for this," Mark interjected. "People are dying, and you could be next if you don't help us." Harlow's gaze hardened. "You don't understand. The Mothman, it's more than just a killer. It's an idea, a symbol. I thought I could catch them, but all I found was darkness." Evelyn leaned in, her voice low but firm. "Harlow, if you know something, anything, that could help us stop this killer, you need to tell us. We're running out of time." Harlow hesitated, his eyes haunted by memories of a case that had never been solved. Finally he spoke. "The symbols, they weren't just random. They were part of an old, forgotten code, a way to communicate something sinister. I never cracked it, but I always suspected it was connected to something bigger, something that went beyond just one killer." Evelyn's mind raced as she absorbed his words. "And you think this current killer has figured it out? That they're using this code to what? Finish what the Mothman started?" Harlow nodded slowly. "It's possible. I've seen the pattern in the recent murders. They're not just recreating the scenes, they're sending a message. And the final murder, the one they're saving for last, it's the culmination of that message. If you don't stop them before then, the consequences could be catastrophic. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was terrifying. The killer wasn't just mimicking past crimes, they were weaving a deadly narrative, one that would end in bloodshed if they didn't act fast. Mark looked at Evelyn, urgency in his eyes. We need to get ahead of this. If we can decode the message, we might be able to predict the final murder and stop it. But as they prepared to leave, a noise from the entrance caught their attention. A soft creak, followed by footsteps. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. The killer had found them. Chapter 6. The Silent Scream. The warehouse was plunged into darkness as the power abruptly cut out, leaving Evelyn, Mark, and Harlow in an oppressive silence. Evelyn's pulse quickened, and she felt the weight of the darkness pressing in on her. The killer was here, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. Evelyn motioned for Mark to take cover, and they crouched behind the old crates scattered across the room. Harlow, visibly shaken, followed suit, though his hands trembled with fear. The only sound was the faint rustling of the wind through the broken windows, a deceptive calm before the storm. Suddenly, a sharp noise echoed through the warehouse, a metallic clang as if something had been knocked over. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The killer was toying with them, using the darkness to their advantage. They were out there, somewhere watching, waiting. Mark signaled to Evelyn, pointing towards the door. They needed to move to find an escape before the killer made their move. But just as they began to inch their way toward the exit, the sound of footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. The killer was closing in. Evelyn tightened her grip on her flashlight, prepared to use it as a weapon if necessary. The air was thick with tension, the kind that prickled the skin and set every nerve on edge. She could feel the killer's presence, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into the very walls. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged, swift and silent, a blur of movement that took Evelyn by surprise. The killer lunged at her, a glint of steel catching the dim light as a knife slashed through the air. Evelyn barely had time to react, throwing herself to the side as the blade grazed her arm, a searing pain ripping through her flesh. She hit the ground hard, her flashlight clattering away into the darkness. The killer loomed over her, the shadowy figure now fully visible. They wore a black hood, their face obscured by a mask that reflected nothing but pure malice. In that split second, Evelyn realized she was staring into the face of true evil. But just as the killer raised the knife for another strike, a gunshot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. The killer staggered, clutching their side as blood began to seep through their clothes. Mark stood behind them, his gun still aimed, his expression one of grim determination. The killer faltered, but they didn't go down. Instead, they turned and fled, disappearing into the labyrinth of the warehouse's darkened corridors. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, clutching her wounded arm as she watched the killer vanish into the night. "We can't let them get away," Mark shouted, already sprinting after the fleeing figure. Evelyn hesitated for only a moment before following, pushing through the pain that pulsed through her arm. They chased the killer through the winding corridors, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. But the killer was fast, agile, and knew the layout of the warehouse better than they did. They reached a dead end, the corridor narrowing into a small, enclosed space. The killer was nowhere to be seen. Mark cursed under his breath, frustration and anger boiling over. "They're gone," he muttered, scanning the area for any sign of the escape route. But Evelyn's instincts told her otherwise. She approached the wall, her hand brushing against the rough surface until she found it, a hidden latch cleverly concealed. She pulled it, and a section of the wall swung open, revealing a narrow passageway leading outside. "They must have escaped through here," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Mark nodded, but before they could give chase, they heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. Reinforcements were on their way, but Evelyn knew it would be too late. The killer had slipped through their fingers once again. They emerged into the cool night air, the sky just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The warehouse stood silent behind them, a stark reminder of the battle they had just fought, and the one they still had to win. As the police cars pulled up, Evelyn exchanged a grim look with Mark. The killer had gotten away, but they had learned something crucial tonight. Something that could give them the upper hand in the final confrontation. The killer wasn't just recreating past murders. They were following a script, a twisted narrative that would culminate in one last devastating act. And Evelyn knew that if they didn't stop the killer before the final chapter, the consequences would be unimaginable. But as she stood there, bloodied and bruised, Evelyn made a silent vow. This time the killer wouldn't get away. This time the story would end on her terms. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The dawn's first light filtered through the clouds as Evelyn and Mark regrouped at the precinct, exhaustion etched into their faces. The killer had slipped through their grasp, but Evelyn knew that time was running out. The final anniversary loomed closer, and with it, the killer's endgame. They had a lead now, the hidden passage at the warehouse. It suggested the killer had intimate knowledge of the location, possibly a past connection to the building. The task force was already combing through records, searching for any link between the warehouse and the cold cases. Every second counted. Evelyn's arm throbbed where the knife had grazed her, but she pushed the pain aside. She couldn't afford to slow down. "We need to focus on the Mothman case," she said, addressing the team gathered around the incident room. "The killer is following a pattern, and this case is the culmination of their twisted narrative. If we can figure out where the final murder will take place, we can stop them." The room was tense, everyone acutely aware of the stakes. Mark stood beside Evelyn, his presence a steadying force. "We know the killer is recreating the Mothman murders," he said. "But what's the common thread? Why these specific victims, these locations?" Evelyn thought back to what Harlow had said about the symbols, the coded message hidden in the original crime scenes. "The symbols," she said slowly, "they weren't just random. They were part of a message, one that's been unfinished for years. The killer is trying to complete that message, to finish what the Mothman started." "But what does the message say?" Mark asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Evelyn shook her head. "I don't know. But I think the key lies in the locations of the murders. The killer has been choosing places connected to the original cases, but also to the trials that ended in acquittals. They're making a statement about justice, about what they see as justice denied." A thought struck her, and she quickly pulled up a map of the city, marking the locations of the recent murders. As she connected the dots, a pattern began to emerge, one that mirrored the symbols found at the original Mothman crime scenes. The locations formed a nearly complete symbol, with only one piece missing. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she realized what the killer was doing. "They're completing the symbol," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "And the final murder will take place at the last point in the pattern." Mark leaned in, studying the map. "But where is that final point?" Evelyn's eyes scanned the map, tracing the lines of the symbol. And then she saw it, a location that had been overlooked, a place with a direct connection to the original Mothman case. "The courthouse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The site of the original trial where the accused walked free." The courthouse had been the center of the storm during the Mothman trial, and now it was about to become the stage for the killer's final act. "That's where they'll strike," Evelyn said, her resolve hardening. "And that's where we'll stop them." The team sprang into action, mobilizing units to secure the courthouse and the surrounding area. Evelyn and Mark geared up, their minds focused on the task ahead. This was it, the final confrontation. Everything they had learned, every clue they had pieced together, had led to this moment. As they approached the courthouse, the sky was tinged with the pale light of dawn, the air thick with anticipation. The building stood silent and imposing, its stone facade a reminder of the justice it was supposed to represent. But tonight, it would be the site of a reckoning, a battle between justice and vengeance. Evelyn and Mark entered the courthouse, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The building was eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. They moved cautiously, their senses on high alert. The killer could be anywhere, waiting to spring the final trap. As they reached the main courtroom, the door creaked open, revealing a scene that sent chills down Evelyn's spine. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of street lights filtering through the windows. In the center of the room, a figure stood, their back to the door. The killer. They were dressed in the same black hooded jacket, the mask still covering their face. In their hand, they held a knife, its blade glinting ominously in the dim light. The final victim was tied to the judge's bench, unconscious but still alive, a crucial piece in the killer's twisted puzzle. Evelyn and Mark moved as one, their guns drawn, but the killer didn't flinch. They turned slowly, the mask's empty eyes locking onto Evelyn. The silence stretched, thick with tension, until the killer spoke, their voice distorted by the mask. "You think you've won?" the killer taunted, their voice cold and detached. "You think you can stop what's already begun?" Evelyn kept her gun steady, her voice firm. "It ends here. No more deaths. No more games." The killer tilted their head as if considering her words. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't just about revenge. This is about setting things right, about bringing justice where there was none." "And you think murder is justice?" Mark demanded, his voice edged with anger. "You're no better than the criminals you're copying." The killer's laugh was hollow, devoid of any warmth. "Justice is what we make it. Those who were supposed to protect us failed. The system failed. I'm just finishing what others started." Evelyn's finger tightened on the trigger, her eyes never leaving the killer. "It ends now." But before she could act, the killer moved, swift and precise. They lunged at Evelyn, the knife flashing in the dim light. The next few seconds were a blur of movement, adrenaline surging as Evelyn and Mark fought to subdue the killer. The struggle was fierce, but they had the upper hand. Evelyn managed to disarm the killer, the knife clattering to the floor. Mark tackled them to the ground, pinning them down as he secured the handcuffs. It was over. Evelyn stood over the subdued killer, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The mask had been knocked askew in the struggle, revealing the face beneath. It was someone she recognized, a former officer who had been involved in one of the acquittal cases, their life ruined by the verdict. Evelyn's heart ached as she looked at them, seeing not just a killer, but a person broken by a system that had failed them. But she knew that nothing could justify the horrors they had committed. Justice, true justice, was about more than vengeance. As the police arrived to take the killer away, Evelyn felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The case was closed, the nightmare over. But she knew that the scars it had left would take time to heal. Evelyn and Mark exited the courthouse, the first rays of the sun breaking over the horizon. The dawn of a new day, a day where justice had finally prevailed, albeit at a great cost. Evelyn turned to Mark, a tired but determined smile on her face. "It's over," she said, her voice filled with both relief and resolve. Mark nodded, returning her smile. "For now." They stood together, watching as the sun rose higher, a silent promise passing between them. They would be ready for whatever came next, but for now they could rest.